Hey everyone, how's it going? This is the Ball Metal Noid coming at you with another video. I apologize for the lack of a video yesterday, but this video every day is proving a little more difficult than I thought. So I'm going to try to shoot several tonight and hopefully at least get through some days this month. Thankfully, this month only got about a week left. But enough about me bitching, whining, and making excuses for myself. Let's go ahead and get into the topic at hand. Basically, there's a popular conception that, the 1980s was the golden age for metal, and, the 90s was dark point or low point for metal. So let's look at trends and see if these generalities are true or if there's a little more nuance than that. So let's think about this. So we're going to go back to the beginning of metal. We're very briefly going to talk about the 70s because for the first several years of the 70s, there was only really one prominent heavy metal band, and that, of course, is Black Sabbath, right? And then in the latter half of the 70s, there were two other bands that I think made a pretty big impact on the scene, and that, of course, would be Judas Priest and Motorhead, right? So, in my opinion, there are only three bands that made a really big impact on the genre during that decade. Yes, there are other bands that kind of fit that bill, like Deep Purple and a few others, but largely I would say those three bands that I named were the most impactful and the best of the decade. So really, you had three bands really nailing it, right? So that's not a giant number of bands, right? So obviously, we all know what happened in the 80s, right? Heavy metal absolutely exploded in popularity and creativity. Now, a lot of bands that would make their mark on the 80s maybe formed in the late 70s. Like Iron Maiden, for example, right? Got their start in the 70s. But regardless, things really came to fruition in the 80s for countless bands. And metal just exploded in popularity and was everywhere, yada, yada, yada. We all know what happened, right? Hell, it was even pop music, hair metal, So the 90s, and I'm sorry, 80s. I misspoke. In the 80s, all the genres that we pretty much know and love came into existence: thrash, death, black metal, power metal. All of these things were happening in the 80s, right? And they were just absolutely phenomenal, right? And then the 90s happened, okay? And we all know what happened in the 90s. Metal was then considered uncool by the mainstream, right? But hair metal more or less died for the most part. But do I think that was a terrible time for the genre? Aside from morons in the media getting it wrong about how metal was dead and blah blah blah, I don't know. I don't think it was that bad of a time for metal. And what really made me examine this, of course, was looking at the data from, my top 50 metal albums of all time. A lot of my favorite metal albums ever came out in the 90s. So I don't think it was a particularly bad time for metal. There was still a lot of innovation going on in the genre. Excuse me. In the underground. There were lots of just fusions of things. Recording technology got miles better in the 90s. I mean, since we had the shift from analog to digital recording, the sound of recordings just got a lot better. And just what bands were able to do got to be a lot more. So, I don't know. I think the 90s was, honestly, for creativity, I think it was a fantastic time for metal. Commercially, not so much. Right? But yeah, I think it's pretty much that simple. I think commercially, the 80s were much better. Creatively, I don't know. I think they were both pretty damn good. I think the 80s and 90s were both exceedingly good creativity-wise. So does that mean one was the golden age? Not necessarily. So let's go past that. Let's talk about the 2000s. We obviously, we had a new thing kind of pop up in the commercial side, and that's, of course, nu metal. And, well, thankfully that didn't last too long. I mean, there are a few bands that are that style that I would consider at least somewhat good, but for the most part, it kind of came and went. But it did deposit some what I would consider, worthy bands along the way. Slipknot, Korn. Actually enjoy those two bands of music. Slipknot a bit more. Other bands that got lumped in there, it shouldn't have been. Some of those were good. And of course, you had utter crap. Limp Bizkit being the most prominent example of the worst music I can think of. So that's basically what happened in the 2000s. And then the 2010s, obviously music sales continued to collapse, which of course started in the 2000s. And then metal more or less went underground again, at least internet-wise. But again, I think there's a lot of creativity in the 2010s, and we're just starting the 2020s. So I don't know if there was a single time that I would look at and say it was metal's golden age. You could make an argument really either way for the 80s or 90s. You can make an argument for now, maybe. I probably wouldn't make that argument because it does seem that since the 2000s, as far as like new subgenres of metal being created, have slowed down significantly. So I don't think we're currently in the golden age. But there is still a lot going on, and one could argue, hey, now that we're in the age of the internet and you can listen to any artist anytime you want, and you can easily, put your music out there. You don't have to go through a label, so the barrier to entry is much lower. That maybe we're in a golden age now. So, whatever. I guess my personal answer is maybe 80s and 90s. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. That is pretty much it. As always, you guys know what to do. Thank you so much for watching. Of course, live long and prosper. Keep on rocking.